Plurilogue Talks is a conversational space between artists and social scientists that are based in the region, in Arabic, English, and other languages. Our exchange takes the form of a plurilogue, a dialogue that goes beyond two sides. Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. It is so lovely to see so many familiar faces and to kickstart our discussion today with the introduction of Anneka Lenssen, currently a research fellow at NYU Abu Dhabi, and who is an associate professor at Berkeley. And she also sits on the board of Al-Mawrid, so kind of wears multiple hats, and a wonderful colleague and I would say now friend. So very, very grateful to her for taking the time today to share with us some of her research. And she was courageous enough to decide to share something that is still work in progress, meaning this is not finished, this is not, kind of like an argument that's already been made, but she's working through it. And so hopefully our conversation today will really enable her to actually figure out what is it that she's kind of trying to say in conversation with others. Generally, with plurilogues, what we like to do is just go around the room and just have people kind of introduce themselves, nothing too long, but just also to answer the question, what brings you here? It just helps everybody become a little bit more familiar with everybody else. And also helps us kind of narrow down the discussion. So maybe I'll just start since I'm already speaking. My name is Mayed Dabbar, and I'm an assistant professor of social research and public policy. I'm also part of the Al-Mawrid Arab Center for the Study of Art, where I work on Haraka Experimental Lab. I'm here because I'm really interested in learning more from Anneka about questions of the archive. Specifically, how do we think about archiving? How do we think about archives in relation to histories that are probably left outside of the archive? And so that's sort of the kind of main interest that I have. Maybe I can move next to Saloua.
Thank you. Thank you, May, for having us. This is a great opportunity for all to listen and share. I'm Saloua Raouda, the director of Al-Mawrid Arab Center for the Study of Art. I'm also a professor of the practice of art history at NYU Abu Dhabi. So I'm very happy to see you all, familiar faces.
Do you want to say anything, Saloua, about what brings you to this group beyond the sort of super self-evident reason?
Oh, well, as I said, I'm a member of the Anneka Lenssen fan club, for sure. And the subject actually, all what Anneka writes and talks about interests me in general, because it's directly related to the region and its arts, most of it at least for the most part. And so that is one aspect. And I know that when Anneka has a special way of looking, a unique way, actually, I should say, of looking at art, which is always very creative and resulting in seminal documents that we value very much in interpreting our archives. And so it is, yes, I agree with you, May, it is related to the archive, but it's also about a certain type of art practice that I don't think anyone has delved into before. So I'm looking forward to see what angle Anneka will take on this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Saloua. Can we just deviate from Al-Mawrid for 1 second and ask Kang-san, our newest guest, to introduce himself?
I'm Kang-san Lee. I'm in the same department as the May in social science and SRPP. I'm an assistant professor who usually studies about the art and valuations across the global region. And that's why I'm kind of interested in it, because I wanted to learn a little bit more about how these Arabic archives can be used in a relation to my own research. And also I was actually wondering how the concept of the Arabness and identity of the Arab artist has been changed over time and how it actually reflected in the market. So it'd be great to learn more about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kang-san. Shamoon?
Hi, I'm Shamoon Zamir. I'm a professor of art history and literature at NYU Abu Dhabi, obviously. I also run the Akasa Photography Archive under Al Marid in partnership with Saloua and May. And obviously, given my kind of 7-year-long commitment to archives, this made a lot of sense. Plus, I wanted to hear Anneka talk. So, very glad to be here.
Thanks, Shamoon. Celine?
Like Saloua, I'm an admirer of Anneka's work, and especially the the way she models close attention to painterly process. I always find that really enlightening and inspiring. More specifically with this talk, I'm interested in my own work in tracking the concept of spontaneity or afawiyya. As it's tied both to existentialist philosophy and related to Kandinsky. I'm interested in tracking the life of this concept through the work of artists, and so I'm also very I'm here also for the specific content of this talk, as I can glimpse it from the description.
Thank you. Ala?
I'm Ala Yunus. I'm an artist and I'm also a research scholar at Al Mawrid. I'm also part of the Anneka's fan club, of course. And yeah, I'm interested in the concept of laborious productivity and yeah, the positions in which artists find themselves, like working on their art, but also for national, like they become part of a national representation, national project. So yeah, I'm here to hear more about this from Anneka.
Thanks, Ala. Dina?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dina. I'm the research assistant here at Al Mawrid, also part of the fan club. I'm interested in both questions of labor and archives, since we don't document. And I've been very lucky over the past few months because both Anneka and I have been working from the Saloua Raouda archives at the special collections. So we've gotten to see some of those correspondences, for example, for exhibitions and like all of that labor that goes into producing a work. So yeah, I'm just happy to be here.
Great, thank you, Dina. Ibrahim?
I'm Ibrahim Muhammad Ali. I'm the assistant archivist at Al Mawrid, and in addition to the fan club, which I'm very proud to be one of its members, I'm sure working with the archives of the Arab artists, it's very helpful also to hear from a very experienced and person, and with all of these new and good ideas and perspectives that will help me a lot to understand the materials and collections, which would reflect on cataloging them in a better way and with a better understanding. Yeah.
Thanks, Ibrahim. So I think, you know, if I could just summarize across the group, there seems to be definitely a Anneka Lenssen fan club that is already constituted in the group. So I'm really delighted because in addition to kind of the substance of the talk today, it's so lovely to be among people who really feel like they are part of a community, community of scholars, of archivists, of people that are producing really cutting edge work on Arab art and the archive. And I guess I'm not going to take up any more time. I just wanted to say that, you know, and to echo what Saloua said about, in a way, how what attracted me to invite Anneka to speak today is how she is really so wonderful in how she's picking up on conceptual categories that seem not only innovative, but absolutely necessary. And so today we're going to hear from her about the figure of the tinkerer. I love that word. It's so playful, yet also so potentially subversive. And thinking about what is the role of the artist in relation to kind of nationalist narratives. How do we read those through the archive? And what emerges in terms of the role of gender as one does this? So thank you so much, Anneka, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, am feeling nervous now, but it is lovely to be speaking in a true community that's been so productive for me. So thank you, May, for the invitation. I want to thank Haraka as well, and of course, Al Mawrid and this genuine learning community. I am presenting work in progress that I've been developing while a fellow at NYU Abu Dhabi this year. So that means many of you are going to hear call outs to open conversations we are still having with one another. So I thank you in advance for your further stimulation and challenge. I'm at the start of a book project that aims to examine how educational missions in post-colonial settings, perhaps most paradigmatically, the task of developing new curricula for national art schools, might also establish a ground for the emergence of experimentalist art, testing out the social stakes of creative formation. This means that I'm in the middle of selecting cases or maybe foci for that book. And I'm expecting that most of my chapters will ultimately pair a relatively well-known artist or even an artwork to a particular educational setting. So I've been testing out art schools in Syria, Algeria, and Sudan for the book. But the truth is that a great deal of experimentalist energy in the art worlds of the later 20th century never found a home at schools in an official accredited sense. So in what's following in this pluralogue is, I hope, an invitation to explore how else to think about histories of making. So examples of creative construction and consistent copious production that are not as readily incorporated into histories of national art worlds, particularly national art worlds that we tell by reference to pioneers and students. So Ibrahim's gonna already notice my hatred of pioneers as a category in telling a national art history. One term I've been using tentatively to think about unincorporated production is that of the tinkerer. It gives a name to occasions of very skilled production, wherein creative accumulation brings recognition to the artist as artist without necessarily securing exchange value for that art as art, or at least not consistent exchange value. That's how I'm trying to define tinkerer at present. In English, to tinker means to occupy oneself with working on something in a casual way, using materials ready to hand, to attempt to repair it gradually and without necessarily a clear end. And interestingly, that word derives from a tradesman called the tinker. So a traveling expert in improvised metalwork that would repair things for a customer. The term tinker also has a well-established place in social theory, albeit primarily by its French equivalent, that of the bricoleur, or the idea of bricolage. So we have Levi-Strauss, of course, in the 1960s, giving us scientist bricoleur relationships, suggesting that the pre-modern is, of course, a modern construct in distinction from something like an engineer and objectivity. And this carries on through science studies until the present. As far as I know, there is not actually a very satisfactory equivalent to tinker in Arabic, although I would be delighted to receive suggestions for vocabularies that might perform some of this work. I'm interested in the gap. What I'm going to be highlighting in a moment is not the term tinkerer itself, but instead vocabularies and images in the Arabic art archive that get mobilized to try to assign values to this incremental manual formation in the arts. So as I foreshadow in my talk title, I have found that the figure of the tinkerer, so again, that's a maker whose productivity is recognized as skilled, but not necessarily as art at all times in terms of collected value, that this often receives a female gendering. Tinkerers rarely worked as lead faculty in national higher art schools, but they graduated from them and they do appear in showcases. They also were pedagogues in other sites of learning, such as workshops, spaces to work with children, and their workshops are organized less as spaces for observation, so like looking at a model and trying to render it, and more as realms for inhabitation and transformation. To borrow from a professor of mine, Caroline Jones, who looked at post-World War II American art personas and highlighted figures like the executive artist or the faculty manager like Andy Warhol. The tinkerer is not necessarily a new economy formation, but as a manual laborer, they are associated with conceptual pursuits, guided by a cause and effect sensibility, trying to reach something that's sort of getting described around it as the form keeps getting changed by the action of the artist. And many of the artists who seem to fit this bill are then women artists working in 3 dimensions. And as a hunch, that makes sense. The body as a site of differentiation or something other than the objective norm, it kind of sort of stands to structure that what might be just outside of that would be woman or would be a kind of 3-dimensional sculpture. So let me offer you some images with which to think these questions. In 1967, Egyptian-born Paris-based artist Celine Chalem opened an exhibition in the United States called Tables You Can Eat On. It is a remarkably photogenic exhibition. Shalom, often introduced in literature as having grown up at the foot of the monumental sculptures of the pyramids, did work in marble, in the hardest, most difficult material. What she delivers here, however, are playful soft forms with gentle hollows made to hold sculptures of fruit-like spheres, which can be moved or turned over to reconfigure the offerings on the table. There's an element of surrealism insofar as the title of the exhibition, which specifies that you can eat on these tables, which seems to make the very idea of eating on a table strange. The work is performatively feminine. That which can be moved around are spheres and vessels. But what I want to highlight for this plurilogue is how the mode of interaction staged for us between the artist and her work is a mode of interaction in which the things are arrayed around the maker. Given that the marble may not, in fact, be eaten, we have a version of functionalism. We are sitting at a table with active configuration toward a goal, but that active configuration remains impractical. I've actually found myself thinking about posture a great deal while looking at the artist archives at El Mawrid. By contrast with Shalem's seated and incorporative position at a table, in this image, which was taken at the College of Fine Arts in Damascus in 1965 and printed in a weekly journal in Beirut, we see the upright posture of an academic art school setting. Even the equipment in the room seems to outline the idea of a vertical projection. We have metal easels drawing this direction in the air. And as I discussed it in an earlier talk that many of you kindly attended, the title on the feature, Institutes for the Engineering of Genius, seems to identify top-down coordination as a virtuous element in a civilizing project. Postures of making are readily gendered. I couldn't resist putting this in here because many of our team considered using this image for our banner for El Mawrid, and then we were hesitant because of the masculinity apparently on display in this particular image. We're looking at a room in the very same school, but dedicated to printmaking and to applied and design arts. The posture adopted in this workshop setting is an intimate one, defined by touch, the interface of plate to paper, but also by force. So you can see the torquing required to churn this printing press. Even though the College of Fine Arts admitted many women students in Damascus, I'm actually hard pressed to think of women who specialized in printing. And I'm certain that Professor McDaddy will be able to come up with many. But what's interesting is that the figure of the master printer, so the professional that remains in that space, is almost always male. And the question then is, does it have to do with the brute aspect of the mechanism? Does it have to do with a presumption of the right to address a mass public? Adjustment of posture could also, in our 20th century art archive, constitute an assertion of creative power or rights. So here we have the very famous photograph by Hans Nemeth of Jackson Pollock engaged in staged act of production of these spatter paintings. And this is him sort of putting that artwork back on the ground so that he can actively assert some kind of index of a physical motion. What's interesting to me is that back in Damascus in the 1960s, this was readily recognized, this shift in posture, as an ideological one. And I love the caption at the bottom, which is identifying this for readers of this newspaper in Humps in 1965 as a defense of bourgeois individualism. So thinking of the artists as like pushing themselves into the lens of the camera as a singular actor referencing themselves. We have wonderful studies in the bigger field of art history of posture as cultural difference. So art historians have highlighted these divergent genealogies for posture of making. And of course, in the long Persianate tradition of manuscript illustration, the site for creation is more frequently figured as a workshop, a space of dialogic learning, of tasks that are partially completed and ongoing in this distributed fashion, and artists that sit on the floor with their drawing board close to the body to capture their act of creation. This interest in posture extends even to the posture of presentation. So we have the great art historian Monica Geneja talking about the humility of offering. So we have a stooping artist to present a portrait to another. In the post-colonial archive, this means that posture is captured in images and in acts of consistent production, sometimes as a post-colonial project of reclamation. So in Sudan, for instance, the artist Ibrahim El-Salahi is often shown in a prayerful position, sort of holding the canvas that he is working on, almost like a writing board. And in the space of educational planning in Sudan, which I've been tracking over the course of my fellowship in the 60s and the 70s, the discussion did have to do with how to produce workshop settings where the student's relationship to what they are making is one of kind of intimate proximity. And so we see the calligraphic lessons of the early 1970s that were brought into that school setting. For the post-colonial school, then, in the archive that I'm trying to work with, we get a way, or thinking about ways to work in an upright posture that keeps the work that of a kind of artisan, capturing examples and working with them intimately. Here we see the artist Kamala Ishaq working on her research for a mural commission that was given to her in 1970 by engaging in rubbing the surface of heritage friezes that she could find in that museum, recovering form by a practice of close touching, creation by proximity to three-dimensional form that she doesn't claim to have produced as an individuated artist, but is bringing back in a kind of incorporative manner into her eventual mural. So for the social scientists on the in this pluralogue, I wanted to thread us via posture through some of the science studies of Bruno Latour. I'm curious what everyone in this conversation actually thinks of Latour, but in his efforts to think about the claims of objectivity in the realm of bench sciences, he compares different ways of photographing the task of the representational narrative in science, thinking about a picture by Jeff Wall that shows an anatomist in one-to-one inspection of an object, comparing it to this scientist that he describes as taking up the active pragmatic pose of the tinkerer, standing up, engaged in pipetting, shaking reagents. And the suggestion here is that what gets produced in science is some sort of a set of instructions or a diagram in 2 dimensions, goes through all of these 3-dimensional elements of uncertainty and adjustment. So he says, in no way can the aesthetic of matters of fact pass for a description of what art scientists do. It is perhaps more what they find. So the deep pleasure of being a fellow here at NYU Abu Dhabi is that I did have an opportunity to talk about the figure of the tinkerer with some of you prior to this talk. And when I spoke with Saloua Raouda about what I was thinking and how I wanted to engage the pluralogue, she immediately thought of many women artists who might fit the bill here. And in those instances, working method and workspace emerge as key markers. So I'm showing you a photograph of Saloua Raouda Choucair's studio in Beirut. And to use the words of Saloua Mikdadi in her essay in the Catalog to Taking Shape, she describes how walking into Saloua's studio, I was immediately struck by how different it was from other artists' studios. Her workspace looked more like a metal shop, strewn with vices, saws, large pieces of metal, pottery, glass, aluminum, bronze, and wood. Saloua created models for all of her work, clay models for the sculptures and small gouaches for the oil paintings. What we have is an artist who accumulates tools, but these tools are not necessarily the tools of her trade in the sense of her trade as an artist. They can be the tools of others brought to bear in this space of making. Saloua and I both thought of Nadia Saikali, also another Beirut-based artist from the 60s and 70s, in part because this striking work of material ingenuity is on display in the Sharjah Art Museum, and many of us saw it together when we took a field trip there at the start of this semester. And I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of the artists that I selected to put in this slideshow were in fact based in Beirut. And I think that's in large part because the carefully cultivated free market ethos in Beirut in the 60s and 70s, which existed beside a great deal of pan-Arab activism, means that the photographic archives from that time capture a range of practices beyond the usual touchstones of the National University and the annual Salon. Which means that the government-employed art professors are not our only protagonists in that city. And it's also because the presence of English and French press mean that these artists are now more easily discoverable by conventional text search indexing. So our Arabic language indexing for the press lags in terms of the kind of immediate, there's plenty of it and we can all find it and we're engaged in that right now, but the immediate text search sort of suppresses the Arabic language archive, and those in Beirut, a multilingual PR space, emerge more readily. Saikali started as a painter. She never really gave up painting, but I wanted to show you here when she shifts into the 70s into these kinetic light works with plexiglass and electrical current. Notice her posture in the PR photographs generated to promote that work. This is her in 1970, the swagger of a planner standing over a linear model that's also the piece, an imagined city drawn on a plane that is also dimensional. Really interestingly, from scholar Helen Khal, we get a discussion of engineering and Saikali's recourse to engineering as being a societal cure for what Khal suggests was previously a lack of attention to detail. The suggestion is if you want to make a kinetic artwork that works, you can't be wrong or approximate on any element of the construction that you're putting together. And on the right, we see Saikali collaborating with the Order of Engineers in Lebanon, who are placing one of her artworks in the spot where a clock had been in their headquarters before. I'm just checking my time because I don't want to. All right, I'll be much quicker. I wanted to show Nuha Al-Radi, an artist from Iraq who produced sculptures from any number of low materials, attending to remainders, vessels, soils, and containers. And from Alat Yunus and her work on the Broken Archive, I first became aware of this mural commission I have on my slide in the bottom left-hand corner, which was a commission for the Iraq Petroleum Company. But thinking about the naming of sources of power. And of course, in the upper right-hand corner, outside my period, in the 1990s, her work with embargo art, the bitter poignancy of making do with objects ready at hand with no market whatsoever. When Radi was based in Beirut, the lower price point for her ceramic work seems to have prompted representation of her oeuvre as rather whimsical. We see image after image of her seated on the ground, offering these vessels to others for their delight and perhaps for their purchase. But in the center, we also see her on an archaeological dig, inspecting shards as analogs for her everyday rootedness in working with ceramics. In this case, the posture goes quite far to signify an element of tinkering. In order to get these things to work, you have to get close to them and sit on the same level. Nuha already took the position of a teacher too. She had a workshop in Beirut, and in that studio, her extensive kiln was a resource that she offered to children. And interestingly, we have a lot of artists in their biographies stating that they studied with Radi. Okay, last case study. I know I have about 4 minutes. In the remaining time, I want to highlight my attempts to read the productivity of the gendered artist as a problem in the Arabic Art Archive by turning to the example of Emirati artist Najat Makki. Her bio is perhaps known to many of us undertaking the project of becoming acquainted with this really interesting archive. She was born in Dubai in 1956. She studied in Cairo, and she specialized in Cairo in the late 70s and early 80s in relief sculpture and metal. She was the first Emirati woman to receive a government fellowship to study. And her bio includes some references to her, to challenges she faced as a woman sculptor, including at least one critic talking about how the sculptor's build should be masculine. She's an institutional presence. She was part of the founding group that created the Emirates Fine Arts Society in 1980. And here again, this is a film that was made in 2013 by another artist and poet with an intimate relationship to Najat Makki. And the posture that we see the artist in is again that of a kind of a humility of offering an experience, and an experience that is made over time with the fine details, in this instance, of producing a tapestry. Najat Makki in the 1980s, she's now perhaps known better as a painter, was recognized as a sculptor. So I'm showing you a schedule for an arts festival, and you can see the a special session devoted to the experience of the artist who work in nahat or sculpture, and we have her there along with these other sculptors of the time. She, in the 1980s, made relatively small scale works, clearly made from small cast off materials that she would solder together. So this is metal work requiring tools to get metal to hold and become a composition. Composition here is something verb-like, right? Like composing these pieces. And her oeuvre from the 80s is characterized in part by its photographic mediation. When a fine art society printed catalogs, it might reprint exemplary items alongside a personal photo or bio. And that's the case for this 1984 sculpture, which is printed here in 1987. Recent efforts by Sheikh Al-Hur El-Qasimi, as well as by the Abu Dhabi Cultural Foundation, have done the work of bringing together the canon of the spectrum of sculptural work from the 1980s. And you can see 4 sculptures on a plinth here from the 2015 Venice Biennale Pavilion for the UAE. Because of that subsequent photographic mediation, we can see the backs of these sculptures. And we can see just how flat the back is and the relief sensibility that the artist is bringing to her constructions. You can see the rivets that are used to hold together the metal elements that Makki's finding and placing into a composition. And you can see the repetition of the identification of portrait in these pieces. From the canon, it's possible to glean an impression of an artist who's working out her relationship to the face of a sculpted art object. These works appear in El Tashkil, the occasional publication of the Emirates Fine Arts Society, even anchoring the back page. This is a piece that I never found a title for, but feels like it's in the sequence of portrait. And I'll maybe end I had a few more points, but to make sure there's time for conversation, I'll just quickly highlight how Makki's status as a tinkerer is distinctive vis-a-vis the other 3D works getting produced in the 1980s by peers also in the Emirates Fine Arts Society. So her sculpture in the 1986 exhibition catalog may be compared to Hassan Sharif's on the left, may be compared to Salam Jauhar's ceramic pieces, which were re-shown in 2015. Here the ceramics are glazed to give a sensibility of totality, a kind of singular vessel. Hassan Sharif's piece, Wooden Column, is the very opposite of a tinkerer. This is something made by someone else, claimed boxed, sort of preserved as non-functional, where the artist gives a particular new meaning to the piece as art and art only. And in 1987, there is work displayed, sorry, in 1988-ish, work displayed by Mohammed Abdallah Bulhaya that we could characterize as a tinkerer. But to my mind, what is key here is the full body of the sculpture that the artist gives us, in distinction from Makki's face, where the relationship of artist to object seems to emerge as the key site of the artist's intervention. So I have some observations about economies and where the tinkerer fits, but I'd like to end us with a little bit of vocabulary trying to describe the tinkering of Makki. And this is a really interesting image insofar as the artwork on the left, I don't think is hers. I think this is a misidentification in the catalog. It looks like Abdul Rahim Salam to me. And I'd be delighted if anybody who knows that oeuvre of the 80s could weigh in. But they're trying to introduce our artist, and they point out that she is interested, she has a particular interest in the style or manner that is modern and technical, in the mixing of her colors and in this particular artistic medium of her artistic sculpture. I'm interested in hearing how artistic gets repeated just to try to secure that status. And I'm interested in the emphasis on the particular as something that's emerging as the artist's particular property that they can mobilize in this emerging art world of the Emirati 1980s. So to make sure we have time to discuss, I'll pause there and pull on the some final ideas if they emerge in the discussion.
That's really great, Anneka. Thank you so much. And so actually the floor is really open for people to kind of just share their reflections or maybe a question that you have for Anneka. I personally would love to hear a little bit more about the question of, you know, how the figure of the tinker enables us to rethink this sort of national canon, what that does to our ideas about how artists represent a particular place or a particular history.
One thing as I was working on the figure of the tinkerer that was really interesting to me is that these are highly trained artists. These are artists that return from studies abroad with credentials. And yet I am using tinkerer with consciousness of the poetic and possible anachronistic element of the idea of a tradesman that goes around and sort of makes do or repairs an object to a model of use that isn't the model of use of a new economy. And so for me, the national canon in the 60s and 70s comes under a lot of pressure because of, one, the revert or the kind of new investment in the idea of the art object as a personal product. And in the 40s and the 50s, especially in the Levant, the sense is that a lot of the art world is structured through civic clubs. So there's a kind of boosterish idea of, and yet self-organization of producing conditions to make work and find recognition for that work as artistic. And in the earlier 20th century, often the figure of the artist is an artist who does have a profession. They like print a card It says photographer, artist, hang a shingle, and somebody who needs a mural painting commission for the decor of their home will find this artist. In the 60s and 70s, this idea of the personal product is helpful, I think, because the tinkerer is both making a personal product, but making a personal product with products of other previous industries. So we have these figures coming in with futuristic associations, right? Like Choucair is forward thinking. She's using the newest materials she can find. Makki is described as having a technical sensibility. And yet the artworks that are getting produced are artworks that don't clearly have students, because these artists are working as educators, but often with children, rather than with the credentialed like next generation of the national art scene. And their actual aesthetic also doesn't seem to fit at the forefront of some idea of development. So we have this figure out of place, or a figure deciding to use the most developed expertise and materials to create works that are clearly still handmade, or maquettes for some future time when the idea can be realized, or some investment in configuration of the present outside of this progressivist idea of the art world. And so attending to that kind of practice, all of the work I ever do argues for that. Like, don't look at what's put in the National Museum only. Think about how discussions are getting produced with artists. What's interesting with the tinkerer is that it is difficult to find record of the discussions produced. It feels like instead an invitation to configuration that can be both very private and yet also be a kind of education. That's what I've been, it's still unresolved, but that's sort of the nut of how I feel these works would fit into the eventual book, even though the rest of the book's about schools. Some kind of maquette or invitation to configure that isn't in a proximate school, but is through a set of examples or like messages to future configurers, something like that.
Beautiful, thank you, Anneka. So the floor is open. If anybody would like to jump in. And
I actually had a question. Thank you so much, Anneka. Like while you were presenting about that tinker, I'm thinking so much about labor, and I'm looking at posture, and I feel like there's such a reflection on the able-bodiedness of people performing the work. And I guess I've been thinking about, where does the non-physically abled body fit into this kind of term of the tinker?
Wow, excellent question. I like that question because I was trying to think about all of the counterexamples, sort of like male gendered tinkerers that are seen as virile, for instance, right? Like there's a kind of other strand of workshop proprietors, somebody like Mustafa Hallaj, who is often described as having a stooped posture, like a kind of striking posture that doesn't fit into this cheerful making. Trying to think of where I wanted to put the tinkerer in relationship to that.
Can I mention something here?
Yeah, please, Allah. Yep.
There's this artist, Brahim Ghannam, who was who was on a wheelchair, and so he was often also portrayed as someone who doesn't have like a super able body. And it's engaging always something else in his body, you know, the functional parts of his body, basically.
Is he a painter?
He is a painter. He is a Palestinian painter. He did these beautiful paintings from 1970s. He was based in Beirut.
I mean, another example to Dina's question about able-bodiedness, ableism even, the tinkerer is somebody who physically continues to move productively, and how to read that. I also thought of like Johnny Tahan, the artist that, and Allah, we've talked about this project by Walid Rad, but this whole project about overlooked Beiruti artists that then come to Rod in a vision. And the part of the narrative that Rod spins is when he misspells the name of Johnny Tahan, that the sort of local art population says, how dare you make this error? This artist has suffered enough. He already is sort of hurt from an older injury that placed him in this peculiar position in the local art scene. I suppose, the title of this talk is to try to think about the problems in the archive. So what doesn't sit in a resolved manner? And I think you're right, Dina, maybe the category of able-bodiedness is even a better way to identify this than strictly gendered, sort of intersectional thinking about what falls out of a normative body and how that is valued. And again, I think of the Arabic art archive and narratives as intersecting with market value, right? If you're not spoken about, your work's not going to be traded at present. So we have also this intersection of the economy with the able body. And I was reflecting before presenting that I had not uttered the word class anywhere. And I think there's some kind of idea of what every body is supposed to be contributing to national developmentalist projects also. By the time we reach a kind of information economy that arguably Saikali is interested in, this early computer work, the idea of what kind of body best contributes starts to shift. And the tinkerer maybe is a way to describe that pressure or anxiety in this time of multiple economies coexisting in an Arab art world at different levels, and then different problems emerging that way.
I have a small reflection, if possible. I think there's two or three ways to think about body posture in these documents. First of all, we are aware that photographs are mostly taken most of the time when they are especially taken in the art studio and exhibitions. They are taken when the artist is aware that they are being photographed and they are possibly self-conscious, so they are really trying to portray some sort of either image of confidence or image of engagement with their work. And when they do not, sometimes they ask them to fake one, right? Like to pretend like you're painting, pretend like you're looking at something, to just counter the very very rigid also ways of doing like this in front of the camera. I think that I am interested in thinking and looking in how the bodies are shaped already, like the disabled part, or like the curves, what like the practice, the way you sit on the floor to work on your work, or the way you bring the work very close to you to work. I mean, the thickness of glasses, all of that are interesting interesting signs within a document on how the artists have used his body, or has used their bodies, how the artists have used their bodies in their work, and also in representing their work when it's being used, whether for their or for their national representation. And so, for instance, there are also how is the body also being surrounded by other fixtures, but also by other characters is also always interesting, because, for instance, I was once working on some work that would feature Tamam al-Akhal, artist Tamam al-Akhal, and we showed an image of her among a group of men, and there was like an objection from some of the administration related to the publishing of this panel on how it's not equally gendered. This image, it shows only one woman versus so many men. And at the time I countered this argument by saying, but look how a confident woman can also be working among a group of men. And so this is more of a realistic situation rather than a more politically corrected representation. So I think these things are all part of how we are using the setup of the art and the artist as a model for an image that is speaking about art or portraying. Because also, again, most of these images are used in national newspapers or media outlets. So they are not necessarily produced just to support an artist's endeavor as much as to create content for businesses again, for like, you know, whether national or private businesses. So, and another possibility is that also to try to match, I liked how you showed the work by Muhammad Abdullah Ahmed, the one that was used also on the bag. It was also folding on the bag. So it's like it made the body as if it's also, you know, sitting or doing other things, which I feel that it's also interesting when the sculptural work is photographed from different sides.
Yes.
And it's giving it different lives and different faces, which does not happen in painting.
Yeah.
So that's also another possibility for posture that could be gleaned from documents.
I love the idea of the like the supplement, like the thickened glasses as another kind of trace of production, not by the tinkerer, but somehow surrounding and extending the tinkerer. And to your point about the highly constructed nature of the photographs, I completely agree. And I find like how did it feel this should be constructed is an interesting question in the moments. And looking through the Tashkil journals and then the exhibition catalogs from the Emirates Fine Art Society, it was remarkable to notice that the photographs of the artists aren't these glamour shots. Like, it doesn't feel like the glamour shot emerges. It's a little like ID card photo. And then I was interested in how artworks, even ones that didn't seem to be from that year or even necessarily appearing in that particular exhibition, seemed to be selected as some kind of supplement to like further identify or secure the artist. So I thank you for the idea of the sort of elements of the body to also track as these surrogates or something that are other kinds of copious production with different kinds of values that need to be secured and resecured in the archive and the market.
Anneka. Thank you, Anneka, for allowing us to think in new ways of thinking, actually, about the body. I wanted to ask whether there's so many women who are tinkerers. So is it possible that they were looked upon as let them tinker, let the women tinker. So it's, a position that the male artists took vis-a-vis the women artists of that period is that their work isn't worthy, so they want to tinker in whichever way. So the women actually had more freedom to be creative and use all sorts of material because they were not, they didn't feel they had to abide by the formal rules of art production.
Yeah, thank you, Saloua. I was thinking about that a little bit. Equally, I was trying to think about something like clay, which is so I mean, to your question about let them tinker, what it means to let them tinker, what to characterize something as tinkering, what are we excluding that province of making from? And clay for me has been something interesting to think about because it seems like a humble material and yet is exceedingly expensive if you're using really nice clay. And so there's a way in which the tinkerer's shop is both inexpensive. You don't have to wait to gain access to the official facility, and yet very pricey, right? The actual outlay of investment to secure these tools. And I need to figure out actually a better way to research this and find prices, because I think the arguments I want to make about experimentalism will require some solid tracking of some of these media. But I'm interested in exactly as you're saying, the let them tinker, but also the value of the materials needed to sustain tinkering. It seems like it is both somewhat abject or less valued, and yet highly valued for the technical specifics of some of these things, such as kilns, but also soldering irons. All of the kinds of finer machinery that might even have been subject to import controls in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. If you start to think about all of that history, the relegation to a tinkerer equally feels like a kind of relegation to an even finer practice. So I am interested in exactly what you're pointing out, that kind of interesting conjunction.
We're coming up to 1 o'clock, but if Anneka, you're happy to continue for a little bit longer, then whoever would like to stay on the call, I'm happy to do that for another 15 minutes at least or so.
I'm very happy to stay. I am like sweating. I'm in Mumbai. So if you see me wilting, it's the heat.
I have one question. I have two questions actually. The first is, it seems that if artists tinker, it's because they've chosen to work with certain types of materials. How do you think about is that true? Does the selection of material precede the selection of method? And do you have a sense of why each of the artists you're looking at chooses the method that they choose to work in, the material that they choose to work in?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thanks, Salim. I have only provisional answers. And one of the reasons I was trying to emphasize that some of these artists also continued to paint, for instance, right? So Nadia Saikali doesn't stop painting. The argument is that her painting questions about composition have to do with the line, and that the line becomes a wire, becomes a way to make line out of plexiglass, becomes a way to animate line. So it's interesting. Maybe to answer, I would say it feels to me from the archive I've been trying to assemble as if tinkering is not determined by the material first, but maybe the question, maybe a question of making that can be only answered by moving between media. Because a metal sculptor isn't a tinkerer necessarily. A tinkerer, and this is why I was talking about the material working but yet being guided by concept. This isn't exactly a craftsman only either, right? In terms of the idea, I mean, in terms of the Beaux-Arts idea that we can all discount, but remains somehow structuring in a lot of art historical writing of studio painter versus the artisan. The tinkerers got a problem that they're solving with things that come to hand. Is what I'm trying to name with this term, maybe. And I think it's worthy of being named because it is a recurring formation that appears in a lot of this literature, even as a lot of these artworks wouldn't have been collected as easily. Now they're getting collected because it feels like we have practices that we can fit into a narrative of kind of a future-oriented practice, which is exciting. But for the decades that I was looking at, it feels like these have a tougher position in terms of the narratives of triumph in beauty or triumph in self-realization. The tinkering is not about self-realization; it's about testing a problem of making.
But it is that making does go on kind of within the umbra of the painting. It sounds like.
No, I was more trying to respond that the objects that I highlighted in the slide presentation, which I did spend some time like looking through what we had in our artist archive and sort of testing myself what I would recognize as tinkerer, more just to say that tinkerers might also be painters. It isn't like you forswear one designation when you take on the other. It feels like there's this quality of artists moving between those positions and even postures in a single career or even a single exhibition. Najat Makki shows paintings, or her paintings are selected to be included in some of the same tashkil issues that the sculpture appears in, for instance.
Great. I think Kang-san also, you had a question?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
you wanted to say something?
No. Just want to ask a few questions because you're focusing on those highly, like well educated in abroad and global art scenes, and also they're actually having those global exhibitions. Do you think their representations or identity as a thinker is differently kind of the features in those Western media versus their local scene, or whether there's some kind of the significant examples that they actually change it, their way to approach those critics or the local audiences versus those like global coverage. And so that's kind of my questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And it's one of the reasons why I marked Beirut as a particularly interesting Arab art scene, in part because the media was so strikingly multilingual. Like the Helen Khal article I highlighted it was in Monday Morning, an English language publication, which is just to say that Western media construction in the time, as distinct from like an Arabic media construction, the same critic would probably be reading the different languages. So there's an interesting way that the conventions that the languages seem to draw on as genealogies come into conversation sometimes around specifically figures that might be problems or harder to articulate. I will say that in the Arabic language coverage of a figure like Najat Makki, who gives her interviews most of the time in Arabic, or in coverage of the Syrian scene in the 1960s, the language, when I was seeing if I felt there was some equivalent to the tinkerer, which does come up in English and French, to Salim's point, the language is a little bit more about the instinctual mark making of an artist. So there'll be a lot of references, even in the colloquial, like to shakhbarat or shakhbatat, like this kind of like early anything to hand becomes a tool to make a mark rather than a tool to construct. And to speculate on how that might fit into either different locuses of economy, like if we're trying to think of Eastern or Western economic flows, or even at present now, an idea of which artists can play in the global contemporary art world, of if we imagine that that art world is all the same. I would say that it has become more exciting, I think, to collectors to identify an artist working in a technical manner where innovation is somehow akin to entrepreneurship or something than it used to be. That in the 60s and 70s, it would be an artist tapping into themselves. And the Arabic language coverage, which is often in relatively controlled newspapers, you know, that maybe financed by the government, this idea of the child that remains present in the adult, that can be a site of playful making, emerges more strongly than it would seem to in some of the other press. And I think that paradigm of the childlike artist is one that a lot of, you know, as an art historian, I think, oh my God, how tired is that? But it's like, it's probably one of the most powerful paradigms for trying to articulate why we should celebrate artists and what they bring to our, what our social worlds. But for like a contemporary art world, the technological discussion of a problem-oriented making, I would suggest has emerged maybe as more exciting. I don't know if that you feel like that answered. That's me trying to knit together market trends, but also the interesting narrative conventions that my project is trying to traverse.
Yeah, because I realized that most of the Lebanese artists back in the 1950s and 60s, they had no choice but to educate it abroad. But nowadays, those like a younger generation artists, mostly educated in local Lebanese institution because there are more opportunities, and then they decide to go out and showcases. So it's just become the kind of the optional. And I was wondering, this different type of education's availability and opportunity for the artists is actually changing their attitude toward this being a thinker, or if there's a change.
Yes, I think that's a really important diagnosis of maybe generations of access to different systems for evaluating art, like giving an exchange value or other kinds of value. In Syria, the establishment of the College of Fine Arts as a degree granting institution is always identified, not necessarily in terms of opportunity. So it's identified as establishing a threshold for the next paradigm of art making. Not necessarily in terms of opportunity, artists continued to get fellowships and study abroad, but in terms of the possibility of being a professional. So upon graduation, getting membership in a union, for instance, or a kind of a card that designates you as a recognized practitioner. And so then the artist category sort of has then associated with it all of these kinds of rights in the eyes of the state, retirement plans, you know, like and that actually from the civic club into the professional setting, the school is this crucial hinge point. And that does shift how we track what artists did. It becomes about a kind of career, or it becomes about their mentorship of other artists in a credentialing school setting. And this like figure that has access to the world experiences of all of these kinds of contemporary exhibitions is maybe the next paradigm. The artist as a perpetual fellow, you know, seeking short-term residencies. And a tinkerer that maybe doesn't fit into that absolutely contemporary paradigm as well, because tinkering does require, at least as I've been trying to track it, all of these tools that are that you kind of accrue and become something you can use in an experimental fashion.
Yeah, Anneka, I just want to mention that I think in Lebanon, the school of the Academy of Art was established in 1937. So there were opportunities for actually artists to study locally. And then there was of course, Beirut College for Women with their very active and important art practice department. But I noticed in the description on the captions for the images that you shared with us, and they're all beautiful. I can see you've been very busy. The Arabic term can be takween for like what could loosely mean assemblage or assemblage. And takween in Arabic doesn't hint to in spontaneous work, but rather takawin. So something that's been structured and imagined and thought of, and then produced as takween. So, but it's interesting that at the same time that takween is translated into English as composition.
Right.
And other times it's assemblage. Right. Started as assemblage. So I think the translation in the Arabic term itself, the use of the Arabic term also has a relationship with the work itself and the understanding of what it took to do these kinds of takweenat, or later on tarkib, murakkab.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Which is more like the translation.
Installation or something. Right?
Work. Yeah. So it's kind of changed, but I remember in the earlier work of the 60s, it was takween.
Yes, like for an abstract painting, right? Like Hamad has a lot of takweens in our archive that we are acquiring.
But it's also used actually in the images you showed. I think there was takween.
It's true, and for one of Najat Makki's, the English translation that I found for it in the 2015 exhibition in Venice, somebody translated it as construction. I don't know how you would feel. Oh yeah, we have all of the different ones.
Yeah, Allah would be good at.
To me, takween didn't feel like construction, so it was interesting to encounter that that translation from a later moment. Tarkib, tajhiz, yeah.
I had a quick follow-up actually. Anneka, you had mentioned that you know, in studying art history, understanding how artists are tied to the national university is important, how the artist is tied to the spaces of that formal art salons is also important. And, you know, in your argument about the tinker, you're kind of saying that in some ways that figure was not really so well established in these two domains, even though they graduated from the university, but technically they never became involved in the kind of professional world of the university itself. And I was wondering if you could just maybe share with us whether there was any other form of social organization that kind of the tinkerer might have been involved in. And the reason I'm asking is because I can imagine that, you know, once you have a collective, even if it's informal, there are all sorts of things that happen, like consciousness raising about particular kinds of labor conditions or about certain kinds of rights, or even coming up with new categories, right? So if the state only gives you benefits when you have the card that says artist, might there be a workaround or like another way to get certain things that aren't necessarily through that, you know, kind of formal category, but in other means? So I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit about that.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I suspect there are others on the call who probably have an even more robust answer than I do. Maybe I'll answer in two, or I'll try to begin speculating in two parts. One is to suggest that, or to point out that in areas of sort of new compositional work, like filmmaking, there have been efforts, and this is me talking from the Syrian case in particular. I know far less about some of the, you know, the Emirates setting, although it would be interesting to see if this were the case there as well. But some of the earliest filmmakers are sort of recalled as tinkerers who needed to set up a facility that would allow for the processing of these images that they're capturing from the world at hand, as well as to come up with a way to screen imagery that makes it shareable. So I'm highlighting that because there's a way in which the art school, with its heavy credentialing, I think gives way in the 70s to collective work to realize a kind of visual communication recognized by many as important for conscientizing education, for keeping pace with not just like how to deliver a narrative, but how to actually bear witness. And the kind of units developed not just by governments, but by you know, liberation groups pull on this idea of some kind of improvised media form that requires hoarding materials you might need to like keep it running as a position that is maybe even ethically outside of the government. So, you know, prior to this, I'm really grateful for that query, because I was sort of talking about who gets recognized with the idea that everybody wants to get recognized. But there are ways to be a tinkerer with a commitment to not receiving the officializing recognition, and exactly as you, I think, were implying, like not being able to show a card, that may be still producing conditions where you can meet a need through technical but concept-driven work. That would require, you know, me doing to really make that case. And I've often felt that to tell a story of fine art, the film has to be in there far more than most of us manage to, because of course archiving film is a whole other thing as well, right? Like we're scanning documents, and we all, I think, would like to have more temporal things. And I know you're working, May, with the kind of archives that do manifest in time, but somehow securing access to that kind of practice is a, you know, adjacent but other type of progress of recovery. But I would say that, yeah, the professional art worlds, as time goes on, there are professionals who seek to evade state recognition that I think we could still slot into what I've been trying to track as maybe a tinkering practice.
It's really great. So I think, you know, this was such a beautiful narration of, Anneka, what you've called a figure out of place. But also, which I think over the course of our conversations collectively emerges as maybe not necessarily a figure out of place, but actually a figure that reworks the place, tells a new story about the place. And I think Saloua's comment about, maybe these women were free actually to be able to, kind of experiment in this way, I think is a lovely starting point to thinking about actually, how do we think about the margins of the canon as actually a liberatory space, or a space that allows us to not just, decenter, but recenter. And I also want to offer 3 other kind of quick things that people mentioned just by way of synthesis. So the first is that in reading the embodiment, it's not just the artist as an individual figure, but rather the kind of collective framings of the artist that happen through, the media industry, a variety of ways of understanding the role of the artist in society. So it's actually, kind of relational and collective, maybe performative even. The second thing is that this question of the intersectional lens that Dina brought up, about is it just gender or is it also maybe being co-constructed by other things? So ableism was the one she brought up, but you brought up this question of class, which could also be really interesting, and maybe even race, and I don't know if that features in your work, but really thinking kind of in a much more like historically situated way about what's operating in these various locations. And then the final one is really about kind of tinkering not as a static category, but a category that is really based on this idea of movement. So it's really not about the form or not about the material, it's actually about moving between positions and what that produces. And so I think, honestly, this was so wonderful and so educational. I feel like I learned so much, and not just through this wonderful presentation, but also from the inputs of everybody on the call. So thank you so much.
Thank you, May, and thank you for Haraka for a wonderful series of Prologues.
Thank you again, May, for the invitation. I pushed my findings much further in an effort to take advantage, and I'm really grateful for everybody's
so wonderful. Like just even hearing what people were saying and taking what you were saying and adding things to it and thinking about translations, it's just that energy is so beautiful, really. So thank you. I learned so much, honestly, today.